Arizona Territory, 1881. Redwater. The sun had barely climbed over the ridge when Sheriff Clay Danner stood at the edge of Redwater's Main Street and pointed his rifle toward the woman he was casting out. "You do not belong here, Rhea Noland," he said, voice flat as dry wood. "You bring trouble with you, and I will not have it in Redwater. You have until sundown to be gone." Rhea did not beg. She just stared at him, her chin high, arms wrapped around her two sleeping boys, twins, barely 5, both curled up on the porch of the old boarding house she had cleaned for shelter. Her face was streaked with dirt and dried tears, but her eyes were clear. "I have nothing," she said. "And nowhere to go? Then you better start walking." The townsfolk watched from shaded windows or behind swinging doors, pretending they were not, but no one stepped forward, not after what happened with her husband, not after the fire. She gathered what little she owned, a sack of bread, a quilt, her boys' shoes, and hoisted one twin in each arm. With a straight back, she walked down Redwater's only road, the hem of her skirt dragging in the dust. By the time she reached the edge of town, the sun was hot on her shoulders and her legs shook. She set the boys down beside a half-dead mesquite tree and crouched beside them. They blinked up, confused and still half asleep. "Where are we going, Mama?" asked Walter, his voice small. Reed did not answer, just brushed the hair off his forehead and kissed his cheek. She was already thinking of the dry hills beyond the old mining path, where no one went anymore. Maybe she could find shelter in the abandoned claims. Maybe they would survive another day. But before she could stand, a horse's hooves came fast down the trail behind. She turned, her hand on her boys' backs. A man rode up tall, his face shadowed beneath a wide hat, his coat dusty, boots worn to the sole. He reined in sharply and dismounted without a word. She recognized him. Everyone did. Wesley Everett. He was older now, leaner than the stories told. His right hand was gloved in worn buckskin, and his eyes were the kind that had seen too much. Folks said he had once led a gang that robbed half the stage lines west of the Colorado. Sheriff Danner had hunted him for years before Wesley vanished into the mountains. "What happened?" he asked, voice low and rough. "They cast us out," Rhea said. He looked past her toward the town, jaw tightening. Wesley dropped to one knee beside the boys and looked them over. "You hungry?" Walter nodded. "We had bread last night." Wesley reached into his saddlebag and pulled out dried meat and a tin of beans. "Not warm, but it is food." Rhea hesitated. "Why are you helping us? You saved my sister's baby in the cholera winter," he said. "You do not remember, but I do." She stared at him. "That was 6 years ago. Still matters." Wesley stood and held out his hand. "Come with me, I know a place." "And what if the law comes after you?" He looked down the trail, then back at her. "Let them." She studied him, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her boys, the steady grip of his hand. Then she took it. They rode double on his horse, the twins in her lap, Wesley leading them away from Redwater and toward the canyons beyond. They reached the highlands by dusk, where scrub pine clung to red rock ledges and the wind whistled low through the cracks. Wesley led them to an old line cabin half buried in stone but dry and sound. Inside was a bed of straw, a hearth, and a stack of wood. "Safe here," he said. She looked around, blinking fast. He stepped close. "You and your boys can stay as long as you need. I will bring food, blankets, tools if you want to fix the place." Rhea nodded slowly, then turned to set the boys down. They were already asleep again, curled together under her coat. She faced Wesley. "I do not know how to thank you. You do not have to." But she stepped forward anyway and placed her palm against his chest. She could feel the beat of his heart, steady and strong. "You came back for me," she said. "I never forgot you," he answered. She did not speak again, but her hand stayed where it was. That night she sat beside the fire while Wesley cooked. The boys slept near the hearth, wrapped in the quilt. Wesley passed her a tin plate. Their hands brushed and her breath caught. "Why did you leave?" she asked quietly. "Too much blood on my hands," he said. "I wanted to be better, but I did not know how." And now he looked at her. "Maybe I found a reason to try again." Their eyes held and something shifted in her chest, not fast but sure. Wesley Everett had once been a wanted man, feared across 3 territories. Now he was bringing beans to her boys and fixing the roof over her head, and she was not afraid. Not anymore. Outside, the desert wind howled against the walls, but inside, the fire was warm, and the silence between them felt like something beginning. The cabin held the night well. Wind scraped gently at the shutters, but the walls stayed firm. When morning came, it brought a hush with it. No bells, no wagons, only the slow stir of pine branches and the crackle of fresh kindling. Rhea stepped outside with a tin basin and a bar of lye soap, walking carefully over the frost-crusted dirt. She washed her hands and face with water from the barrel Wesley had hauled in before sunup. Her hands stung from the cold, but she didn't flinch. She'd known worse. From behind her came the sound of boots crunching dry needles. Wesley had returned with a satchel slung over one shoulder, a coil of rope hanging from the other. "There's a spring over the ridge," he said. "Clean runoff. I'll show you when the boys wake." She dried her hands on her skirt. "You don't have to stay, I know." He set the satchel near the cabin wall. "I want to." She studied his face. New morning light softened the creases around his eyes, but his jaw was set like the choice wasn't one he'd made lightly. "I don't expect anything," she said. "I'm not here out of guilt, Rhea." She opened her mouth, then closed it, her hands, still damp, pressed against her thighs. "I should gather more wood. I already cut some, behind the shed. I could cook. I brought cornmeal. You still know how to make ash cakes." She hesitated, then nodded. "I'll need a flat stone, clean one." He took off his coat and handed it to her. "Wear this until the sun's higher." The wool was heavy, worn at the shoulders. She slid it on and didn't look at him while she did. Later, the boys woke and ran barefoot over the packed earth outside, kicking up dust and pine needles. Wesley watched them without speaking, his arms crossed. When Reed fell and skinned his elbow, Wesley crouched beside him without hesitation, pulling a strip of cloth from his saddlebag and wrapping it with care. Rhea watched from the doorway, one hand resting on the jamb. "You got children?" she asked once the boy had run off again. "No," Wesley stood, brushing off his knees. "Never thought I'd be around long enough to raise him." She didn't reply right away. "Then you're still here." Something changed. She shifted, half smiling without warmth. "I don't give my trust lightly. I don't want it fast." The words hung between them, honest and plain. That afternoon, she took the boys up to the spring. Wesley stayed behind, patching a hole in the roof with old cedar shingles. When they returned, the cabin smelled of rabbit stew and wood smoke. The boys ate without fuss, then fell asleep curled together on the straw. Wesley sat outside under the stars, legs stretched out, a tin cup between his palms. Rhea joined him, folding her hands in her lap. "You never told me what happened in Dry Fork," she said. "Didn't figure I needed to." "I heard the sheriff caught you in a saloon, said you drew first." Wesley sipped from the cup, then set it aside. "He lied. I walked in to pay off a debt. I didn't come for a fight." And the bullet in his arm, I aimed low, could have done worse. She nodded slowly. "You're not who they said you were." "No, and maybe I never was." A long silence settled. Rhea pulled the coat tighter around her. "I never planned to leave Redwater the way I did," she said quietly. "I know." She looked at him, her eyes steady. "You rode in for me." He didn't look away. "I'd do it again." The fire popped between them, sparks rising like stars that had lost their place. She reached out slowly, fingers brushing his. He didn't move, just turned his hand to meet hers, their palms warm together in the cold. Neither one spoke again that night. But when the wind rose, they stayed seated, side by side, watching the dark hold steady around them. The days narrowed into a rhythm shaped by necessity. At first light, Rhea hauled water from the spring, while Wesley checked the snares he'd set near the arroyo. She mended what she could, pants worn through at the knees, a cracked boot sole, the seam of a curtain to hang across the cabin's open doorway. The boys gathered kindling or sat in the dirt tracing shapes with sticks, their voices carrying with the wind but never straying far. Wesley didn't press her, didn't fill the quiet with questions or reassurances. He worked beside her, steady and wordless, until the air between them grew easy. One afternoon, with the sky pale and stretched thin, Wesley led her to a narrow draw tucked behind a sandstone ridge. Low brush skirted the edges, and a stand of cottonwoods shaded a long-forgotten outbuilding, its roof sagging but intact. "Figured we could use a place to store extra supplies," he said. "If we're stayin' through winter." She glanced sideways. He met her eyes. "Only if you want it that way." She walked the perimeter, running her hand along the old boards, then turned back to him. "You always think ahead like this." "Didn't used to. Lately I can't help it." She nodded once, not smiling, but her gaze held his a moment longer than it had before. They cleared the inside together, sweeping out straw nests and broken crates. Rhea picked up a rusted horseshoe from the corner. "You ever shoe your own horse?" she asked. "Not well," he said. "I learned just enough to keep him moving." She set it on a shelf. "You strike me as a man who taught himself near everything." "I had to." They worked until the light began to shift. As they walked back, she asked, "What was your sister's name?" Wesley brushed dust from his sleeve. "Clara. She married young, too young. Her husband died in the mines outside Globe City. She came down with the fever not long after. Then it was her boy I helped." He nodded. "She never stopped talking about how you stayed, even after others left. She said you were the only one who held him when he cried." She looked ahead, eyes fixed on the trail. "I remember his cough. He gripped my braid like it was the only thing tethering him to this world. That's how I remembered you. Not by name, but by the braid." That night, back at the cabin, Wesley carved a new handle for the kitchen knife using cottonwood from the draw. Rhea sat across from him, patching a wool blanket with twine and thread. The boys were asleep early, worn out from following a rabbit trail clear to the ridge and back. Rhea set down her needle. "You ever think of leaving the territory?" "I did. Thought about California, Oregon, but I kept circling back here." "Why?" He set the knife down. "I think I was waiting to see your face again." She studied him with a stillness that gave nothing away. Then she said, "I used to dream of New Mexico. I thought if I could ever start over, it'd be there." "You still want that?" She didn't answer right away. "No. Not anymore." Wesley leaned back, stretching his legs toward the hearth. "I know how to lay fence and read the sky. I can work a trap line and mend a wagon wheel, but I don't know how to ask for something I want." Rhea's voice was quiet. "So what is it you want?" He looked at her over the firelight. "To build something that won't burn down." She looked down, hands resting loose in her lap. "I've carried too much loss to believe in easy things." "I'm not offering easy." She raised her eyes. "Then you might be the first man who ever made sense to me." He didn't reach for her, didn't move closer. Just waited. Outside, frost crept over the windows and the pines whispered against the eaves. Inside, her fingers brushed the edge of the blanket and then, slowly, reached across the space between them. She placed her hand over his, and didn't let go. 3 weeks passed. The trees thinned of their last gold and frost lingered longer each morning. Rhea had started waking before dawn, not from necessity but from habit, the kind that came from knowing you were needed. She'd warm a stone near the hearth and tuck it against the boy's feet before she stepped outside to grind corn or tend the fire. Wesley would already be up, setting snares farther west now, where the rabbits moved in colder weather. One morning, while the boys collected pine cones to use for kindling, Rhea stood at the edge of the ridge with a shovel in her hand and a line drawn through her thoughts. The ground was hard but not frozen yet. She wanted a garden come spring, even if it meant breaking the soil one patch at a time through winter. Wesley approached, a worn canvas sack slung over his shoulder. He crouched and ran his fingers over the dirt she'd turned. "You aiming to plant high this close to rock?" he asked. "I want to see what'll take," she said, pulling her shawl tighter. "Maybe onions, maybe carrots, something that doesn't mind fighting. You could try root sage too. My sister used to dry it for winter stews." She wiped her brow with the back of her wrist. "Was Clara older or younger?" "Older," he said, brushing earth from his knee. She had this way of keeping everyone's feet on the ground, even when the world was falling apart. Rhea rested her hands on the shovel. Sounds like someone I'd have understood. She'd have liked you. They worked side by side until the sun climbed higher. When they returned to the cabin, Walter had built a lopsided stack of pine cones near the stoop and was arranging them into rows. Rhea sat beside him humming, his fingers smudged with charcoal from the hearth. "Where'd they find charcoal?" Wesley asked. "I gave them a burnt stick after breakfast." "They've been drawing on bark slats ever since." "You draw too?" he asked. "Used to. I sketched a map once for a friend's husband when he couldn't read the trail signs out near Prescott. Still have it." "No," she said, brushing her skirt flat. "It burned." Inside, she set a pot of beans on the coals. Wesley pulled a cloth bundle from his sack and laid it on the table. Inside were 3 tanned rabbit pelts stitched neatly at the edges. "Thought the boys might need mittens," he said. "You've got smaller hands than me." "Figured you could shape them." She ran her thumb along the edge of the stitching. "You know how to sew." I watched. When I had nothing else to do, she looked up. "You ever get tired of being alone?" I did. Rhea folded the pelts carefully and placed them in the basket beside the fire. She didn't speak again until the beans were soft and the boys had eaten every last spoonful. Later, when the boys had gone to sleep, she sat beside the hearth with her hands folded in her lap. Wesley placed another log on the fire, then settled on the floor across from her. "You think they'll come looking?" she asked. "Redwater's a long ride, and Sheriff Danner's pride won't let him admit he lost track of me." "He looked through me when he cast us out," she said, "like I was already gone." "You're not," Wesley said. "You're here. And no one's taking you from this place." She watched the embers shift, then turned to him. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life waiting for something to go wrong. You won't have to." He didn't say more, and she didn't need him to. She reached for the quilt beside her and unfolded it slowly, laying it between them. Then she held out her hand. He took it. She guided him beside her, their shoulders touching as they leaned back against the wall. The fire flickered low, casting soft light across the room, and in the quiet that followed, no promises were spoken, only held, in the way her head came to rest against his shoulder and his hand settled gently over hers. Out past the cabin, the wind moved through the trees like a hush. Inside, warmth held. The first snow came before sunrise, fine and slow, dusting the ridge like sifted flour. Rhea stood in the doorway wrapped in her shawl, watching it gather on the cedar branches. The air smelled clean, sharp with cold. Inside, the boys were still asleep, their breathing even under layers of wool and rabbit fur. Wesley stepped up beside her, holding 2 tin cups. He passed her one without speaking. The steam curled between them. "I found a trail of elk prints down past the hollow," he said. "Fresh. We've got a chance to carry meat through the rest of winter." She took a sip. "You'll have to leave early. I'll be back before dusk." She turned toward him. "I want you to show Walter how to track when the time comes." "I will." He left not long after, rifle slung over his shoulder, snow crunching beneath his boots. Rhea watched him disappear into the brush, a dark figure swallowed by the white. She passed the morning tending to the hearth and boiling water to scrub the boys' linens. Rhea helped her carry the pot, arms straining with the weight, while Walter stayed busy tracing letters in the soot near the chimney. By early afternoon, clouds thickened, and the wind began to shift. Rhea stepped outside to gather the drying pelts from the line, her hands red from the cold. She paused when she saw the first crow circling wide above the hill. She waited longer than she meant to, eyes fixed on the trail Wesley had taken. The light was failing fast. When the sound of hooves finally reached her, she didn't move at first, afraid it belonged to someone else. But when the black horse came into view and she saw Wesley's coat dusted white, the tightness in her chest eased. He swung down with a grunt, rifle across his back, the haunch of the elk bound behind his saddle. "You were longer than you said," she said, voice steady. "I lost the trail near the creek," he said, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Took some circling." She reached up, brushing a clump of sleet from his collar. "You're freezing." He didn't answer, just looked at her with something quiet in his face. They dressed the elk together, working under the lean-to with the boys watching from the doorway. When it was done and the meat stored in the snow-packed pit behind the cabin, Wesley washed his hands in the basin and stood by the fire, warming his palms. Rhea poured water into a basin and knelt beside the hearth to scrub the ash from her skirt hem. "You ever think about marrying again?" Wesley asked. She paused, then sat back on her heels. "I did once, after my husband died, but it passed." "Why?" "Because what I wanted didn't exist back then, or I didn't believe it could." He crouched beside her. "And now," she looked at him, her hands still damp. "Now I know a man who carries water before I ask, who remembers my boys' names, who makes a place safe just by standing in it." He watched her face. "Rhea, I want to stay, not just through winter. I want to build something that holds." Her throat tightened, but she kept her voice clear. "We don't have rings or papers, not out here. We don't need those to tell the truth." She reached forward and touched his cheek, her fingers warm against his cold skin. "Then the answer's yes." He leaned into her palm, then pressed his lips to it, eyes closed. She pulled him into her arms and they stayed there beside the heat and quiet until the wind outside stilled. They married with the boys standing between them, Reed holding a woven strand of yucca leaves, Walter carrying a carved wooden heart Wesley had whittled in the evenings. Rhea wore her hair pinned up with a bone clasp Wesley had found near the ridge. He wore a clean shirt, the collar pressed flat. They spoke their words without witness but the land itself. Then they shared stew and cornbread, and the boys climbed into Wesley's lap as if he'd always been theirs. Spring came slow and green. The garden sprouted high with onions, carrots, and sage. Wesley built a fence from downed pine, and Rhea taught the boys to read from an old book salvaged from a wagon trunk. The cabin grew fuller with laughter, with warmth, with the sound of boots returning each evening and water boiling for supper. Wesley carved shelves for Rhea's sewing. She stitched him a vest from the leftover hide of the winter elk. One evening, as a breeze lifted the scent of sage through the window, Rhea sat beside Wesley on the stoop, their hands clasped. "I used to think love was just survival," she said. "And now I know it's the reason we survive." He kissed her hand, slow and sure, then rested it against his chest. "We'll hold," and they did, always.